Students, I welcome you on behalf of Thakur Vidya Mandir High School and Junior College for Remote Teaching Learning Process, where our motto is let learning be a joy and teaching a pleasure. Today, let us continue with the fifth part of Chapter 1 Introduction to Corporate Finance, which is the last and the concluding part of Chapter 1. In this chapter, in this session, we are going to understand about capital structure and its components. Dear students, let us move towards the next question, the sixth question, which is define capital structure and state its components. As you can see, this question has been divided into two parts, that is capital structure and its components. So firstly, we need to understand the meaning of the term capital structure and then we shall move towards its components. What is capital structure? Let us have a brief understanding of the same. As discussed earlier, we very well know that capital has to be raised from variety of sources, various sources which consist of owned capital and borrowed capital, which means that a corporate house, a large scale joint stock company has to raise funds not only from the owned capital, but it also requires to borrow capital. It also requires to raise amount from loan. Examples of owned capital could be equity share capital, preference share capital, and reserves and surplus existing within the company. But this sources, that is the own capital, is not at all enough to carry on the business activities on a large scale. A business organization further needs to move a step ahead where it has to go towards borrowing funds. Examples of borrowed capital could be in the form of debentures, taking loan from bank, taking loan from financial institutions. Besides this, it can also accept public deposits and so on. So, from this, we can conclude that the capital of a joint stock company comprises of owned capital, that is equity share capital, preference share capital, reserves and surplus. Not only that, it also has to raise capital by means of loan, that is in the form of debentures, bank loan, loan from financial institutions, public deposits, etc. So the capital is nothing but it is a mix of these various sources. Now we come to the topic capital structure. So what is actually capital structure? Capital structure is nothing but the mix up of these various sources of funds in a proper proportion, which means that whenever a joint stock company raises capital in a proper ratio, in a proper proportion, mixes this amount of securities in a proper blend, in a proper manner, it is called as capital structure. Capital structure also means to decide upon the ratio of these different types of capital, which means that the corporate houses are supposed to take decision as to what should be the amount of equity share capital, what should be the amount of preference share capital, how much reserves to be used, how much amount to be raised by means of debentures, how much to take bank loan and how much to take loan from the financial institutions. And that is why capital structure is also called as a security mix, as it is a mixture of the variety of securities in the form of shares, debentures, bonds, mutual funds, etc. So, to conclude, it can be said that capital structure is nothing but a mix-up of various sources of funds in a desired proportion or a desired ratio. Let us now move towards the components of capital structure. The first component of capital structure is equity share capital. Equity share capital represents the ownership capital of a joint stock company. It is the basic source of financing business activities in any organization. It is said that a company cannot exist without equity shares. it is compulsory for all the joint stock companies to issue equity shares. A person who purchases equity shares are considered to be the owners of the company. So that is why equity share capital represents the ownership capital. When we speak about the ownership capital, in that case, definitely some risk is associated with the business activities, and accordingly, equity share capital have to bear the ultimate risk, which means that the ultimate risk related to any business organization has to be borne by the equity shareholders. Just like they bear the risk, they also enjoy profits, and these profits are in the form of dividend which they get at a fluctuating rate. Fluctuating means changing. The dividend given to equity shareholders depends upon the profits of the company. Higher the profits, higher will be the dividend. Lesser the profits, lesser would be the dividend. And in case of losses, they may not even get the dividend. Equity shareholders do get their repayment of capital amount at the time of liquidation only when the amount is repaid to the preference shareholders, which means that equity shareholders are given dividend only when the dividend is paid to the preference shareholders. Not only that, even when it comes to the repayment of equity capital amount at the time of liquidation, it is the preference shareholders who enjoy priority over receiving this amount before any amount is paid to the equity shareholders. Let us now move towards the second component, which is preference share capital. What do you understand by preference share capital? Preference shares are those shares which carry preferential rights or priority rights over the equity shareholders. Preference shareholders enjoy two priorities over equity shareholders. The first one among them is preference in payment of dividend. Whenever the company is about to pay the dividend, firstly, the dividend is paid to the preference shareholders, and then if any amount is left over from that, the equity shareholders are paid dividend. Accordingly, they enjoy preference in payment of dividend before any dividend is paid to the equity shareholders. The second preferential right enjoyed by preference shareholders is they also enjoy preference for repayment of capital at the time of liquidation of company. When the company winds up, liquidates or shut down, at that time, firstly, the capital amount is repaid to the preference shareholders, and then if anything is left out, the amount is paid to the equity shareholders. As the preference shareholders enjoy these two preferential rights, they are called as preference shareholders. One more important feature of preference shareholders is that they get dividend at fixed rate irrespective of the profits or the losses earned by the company. Their dividend does not depend upon the profits or the losses of the company. They get a fixed rate of dividend. Let us now continue with the third component, which is retained earnings. Retained earnings are also called as retained profits. Whenever a company earns profit, the entire amount of profit is not distributed among the shareholders as dividend. Certain amount of the profit is kept aside in the form of retained earnings. Company thinks of doing so thinking about the future growth of the company, future expansion of the company. It represents the savings of the company. And that is why, as this amount is kept aside out of the profits, it is also called as plowing back of profit, that is pulling back of profit and keeping the same amount aside for future growth and expansion. Retained earnings are also called as internal source of financing because the company did not borrow from anybody else from outside. It manages to finance its business activities for growth from the retained earnings itself. It is considered to be the cheapest and the simple method of raising finance because the company did not pay any interest for the same. So retained earnings are nothing but the retained profits of the company. So whenever the company does not utilize the entire amount of the profit and keeps aside, the same profits are utilized in the future for financing its future projects. The next and the fourth component is borrowed capital. As discussed earlier, ownership capital is not enough, even the company has to borrow. This borrowing can be firstly in the form of debentures. What do you understand by debentures? Debentures represent the loan capital, and so it is nothing but an acknowledgement of loan which is taken by the joint stock company. Whenever a company issues debentures, it means that it has taken loan from the general public. Whenever loan is taken, definitely something written has to be given for that, and this written is in the form of interest. So the debenture holders are provided interest at a fixed rate at regular intervals. Now, whatever amount is raised by means of debenture loan capital, this amount has to be repaid at the time of maturity. The company is not supposed to keep this amount till its liquidation. It has to be repaid at the time of maturity as decided according to the policies of the company. So, debenture is nothing but a form of loan, a type of loan which is taken by the corporate houses from the general public, for which it is supposed to pay interest. Not only that, it has to repay this amount at the time of maturity. The second type of borrowed capital is in the form of term loans. A company also takes loan from banks and financial institutions for which it is required to pay a fixed rate of interest. So, borrowed capital can be in the form of debenture as well as in the form of term loans. So with this, dear children, we completed all the four components of capital structure, which included equity share capital, preference share capital, retained earnings and borrowed capital. Let us now move towards the last question of this chapter, that is distinguish between fixed capital and working capital. You can find this distinguish in your SP textbook on page number 9. This is considered to be one of the most important distinguish between, as it has been asked many times in the previous years. So see to it that you learn all the 6 points given over here. We have already discussed the meaning of fixed capital and working capital. That will definitely help you in learning the distinguish between fixed capital and working capital. Thank you, dear students, for your patience listening.